My name is Seth Gehle. I grew up with a single mother of three. As long as I can remember, it was just us and my mom all the way back to like kindergarten. I remember coming home being alone. So she would be with us at night, but during the days, we were home alone at 5, 6, 7 years old. And I never had my father in my life either. He went to prison for a long time. When I turned probably about 9 or 10, that's when things started to click for me that I was not living a normal life. And I remember looking into the living room and my mom was smoking, drinking with a bunch of guys in there. Both my sisters were in there, and at least my older sister was smoking with them, and she would have only been 10 or 11 at the time. What started to happen was my mom would beat us or whoop us. My mom walked in my room one time. My sister was in there, and I was playing my video games, and my mom kicked open the door and turned and looked at my sister and close hand punched one of us, and my sister's head snapped back, hit the wall. And as soon as that happened, I jumped on the other side of my bed to like crouch and hide, and my mom proceeded to hit my sister a few more times in the face. I was about 10 years old when this happened, and I look up at my mom and I'm crying. I'm like hysterical, and my mom looks at me and says, "What are you crying for? Stop being a little bitch." It is not the physical parts, it is the emotional damage that it does to you after. A few weeks later, I had walked home from school and I wasn't supposed to, so I came home really late. Understandably, my mom was upset and I should have learned a lesson. And so she took me upstairs to do that, which was typical, but this time was a little bit different. I was laid out across her bed and she had her paddle and she started to whoop me. And I know the first time she hit me, the way it felt, I just knew something was wrong. I knew that this was different. And she hit me, I think another time, and then I fell to my knees and she kept swinging. And so she kept swinging and was striking me across my back with this big wooden paddle, like a solid piece of wood, and tore me up. She hit me about 3 or 4 times across the back, and I fell down and I was crying, screaming because I was begging her to stop because she wasn't hitting me on the butt anymore. I remember laying there on her bedroom floor and I looked up at her and I was crying and I was just like, what the hell? And, she told me get the out of here, go to your room is what she said to me. So I crawled to my bedroom and I laid there for 2 hours crying. And the physical pain, it sucked, but truthfully, looking back on it, I was so emotionally destroyed because of the lack of love. There was no respect for me. There was no learning. There was no teaching there. It was just, that was abuse. On top of the abuse and the in the house and the drinking all the time, there would be days where we didn't have power. There would be days where we didn't have heat. So I remember we always had to put our bath water on the oven or put it inside the oven or on the stove to warm up our bath water and take it upstairs and put it in the bathtub so that we could have a warm bath. If I spent the night at a friend's house, I would see that mom and dad are here, they have food in the house. There was this warm feeling at their home. And we just didn't have that. Because of all of those things, when a child is going through that, they are going to look for love somewhere. And that's kind of where I would eventually get into the worst part of my childhood. I started finding myself outside of the house a lot more. And I was over at my friend's house, and my friend was about 5 years older than me. So he was about 15. This kid was my protector. He was my best friend. He was older. I always found myself around older kids, maybe 2 or 3 years older than me, because they were bigger, stronger, and they could protect me. I was a really small kid. He tells me he's going to his friend's house this weekend, and his friend comes in the door, and his friend is this grown man. This man is about 6'5", 380 pounds. He's got these big wire frame glasses on. He's got long, dark hair. He's a Hispanic guy. He was a massive guy, and he didn't look sloppy. He looked very capable. He looked like he could throw a hard punch. That's how I always describe him. And I remember the first thing he said to me was, do you like playing video games? And I said, well, yeah, I love playing video games. Do you like football? Yeah, I love football. Do you like the Buckeyes? Love the Buckeyes. And so he says, well, do you want to come up and hang out with us this weekend? And so I said, sure. I got to go home and ask my mom. So I go home real quick and I ask my mom, can I go hang out with my friend and his friend? Well, who's his friend? Well, he's this guy. And my mom says, no. What do you mean? So then my younger friend who's 15, he comes over and he defends the guy and he says, hey, he's okay. My mom says, fine, as long as you're with him, you can go to his house. And so that's when it all kind of started for me. We would go to the guy's house and he lived about 30 minutes away. I remember driving up there. He drove a little white Honda Civic. It was a really old car, and I remember there was trash all over his car. His whole floorboard was covered in trash. The reason why I talk about his car so much and the trips going up there was a 30-minute drive, and I just remember like being around this grown man who we could cuss, we could listen to whatever music we wanted to listen to, and there was nothing off limits. And so it was just cool to be around a guy like that. And then we get up to his house. It was just a big open studio. There was no bedrooms. In the back left corner, there was black curtains, like sheets hanging from the ceiling, and it blocked off the back left corner, and that's where his bed was. The crazy part about it, he was so good at making us comfortable. These people are very calculated, they're very strategic, and they're very smart and intelligent. And he was smart, period. But if you want to do this to children, you want to do this to kids, you have to be calculated about it, because if not, you'll get caught. He was very good at the grooming process, because I came in like with open arms. I was like, this is awesome. And I never had any suspicions of anything going wrong. But I remember going up there and I always slept behind the couch. I slept on this like little rollout thing. My other friend slept with him in his bed. And I never really thought anything about it. I thought like if same thing, if me and my buddies were all spending the night together, we might all sleep in the bed together. And eventually it would lead to me sitting in this guy's lap. I would come up on the weekends and we'd hang out, and then at some point I would end up in his lap somehow. Probably after about 2 or 3 months of going up there, I had started to get more comfortable sitting in his lap and like being just kind of getting closer and closer to the inevitable. After about probably a month or so, after about a month and a half, 2 months, I would go by myself. On this one particular weekend, the first time he really kind of made a move on me, I guess, I was actually there with my friend, and my friend had left to go get tacos down at Taco Bell. It was like right down the street. There's 50-cent tacos on Sundays back in the day, and we would just get like 40 or 50 of them and tear them up, and then we'd go home. And so my friend goes down the street to go get some tacos, and I'm sitting in the guy's lap, and he had his left arm around me on my left hip, and I was still 10 years old at this time. I remember sitting there, we're watching like football or something, and his hand slips off my hip, and he brushes my butt, and he says, "Oh, I'm sorry." I said, "Oh, no big deal." Like I attributed it to like me and him passing each other in a hallway. You know, hey, we bump into each other, it's not a big deal. And so he picks his hand up and he puts it on my butt, and he says, "Oh, so this is okay?" And I said, at this point, I said, "Sure, not a big deal." And then he kept his hand there and he said, "You don't mind if I keep my hand right here?" And when he said that, I was like, okay, this is what we're doing. Like I was very aware of what was happening. When he kept his hand on my butt, I knew that I was about to be subjected to something that I did not want to do. Unfortunately, I froze and I kind of just accepted it. And so my friend gets back and he moves his hand out the way and we go home. Over the next probably 3 months, things would escalate and continue to escalate, where every time I would come to his house, it would be immediately sitting on his lap. We'd play video games for a couple hours, and then he would start to grab me more and more. He would start to take his hands and stick them inside my shorts. And I remember, right now, I can feel his hands. Like I can feel he had these, like I said, these massive hands, and they were so dry. He had these like massive calloused hands. His knuckles were calloused, and they were so calloused, as a matter of fact, he would take them and rub them. He could rub his fingers together, or he would just rub his knuckles against his hand, and it sounded like sandpaper, but he would always do that. And so that's like a sound that I can always remember. And these like sensory things are what get to me now. But I remember the rough texture of his hands touching me, touching my butt, touching my bare skin. And he had these long nails. So I remember his long nails. And eventually it would lead to him putting his hands in my shorts, which would eventually lead to him touching like my penis. And then he would eventually start to reach around and grab my butt. I can remember what his hands feel like to like spread my butt, and for him to try and stick his finger inside of me. And it always hurt, obviously, but I told him like, your nails, like they hurt. So he actually would trim his nails for me, being this like gentleman that he was. So this all happened, within about 6 months of knowing him. It started to escalate pretty quick. It started to be reciprocated, where he would make me touch him. And I say make, and it sounds crazy, but they will get in your head so bad that you'll do things that you just don't want to do, but you're just gonna do them. And I don't even know how to explain it. It's like mind control. His relationship was never threatening. That's one thing I'll say about it, is I never felt threatened. I never felt scared. I was never like forced into doing anything. His relationship with me was very caring, I guess, for lack of a better term. He told me he cared about me and that I was special and that I was the only thing that mattered to him. And even on these car rides, he would sing songs to me, or he wouldn't sing songs, but he would dedicate songs like by Meatloaf and Hairspray back in the day. Like I Would Do Anything for Love, like those kind of songs, like those 80s like rock songs. He would dedicate those love songs to me, and he'd play them, and he would say, "I think about you when I listen to these." And so at 10 years old, I'm like going up to his house. I'm like, this is really really weird. But unfortunately, my home life was not much better. And so on the weekends, like, this was my escape. If all I had to do was like sit in this guy's lap, I could play video games all weekend and eat a bunch of free pizza. Like, it wasn't that bad to me. Once he started putting his hands on me and really in my shorts, and so he wasn't violent. It was just, he just had rough hands. And so eventually, though, he would get me to reciprocate the same feelings. And so I can remember sticking my hands like into his shorts, and then, or just, and I know I did not want to do it. One thing you'll hear a lot of people talk about when they go through these things is that they like detach and they're in a different place and they don't remember, or they're able to like disassociate. I could never do that. I was very present and aware the entire time. And I know that because it felt like years of sitting there in his lap, or when he'd take me back to eventually he would start taking me back to his bed and I'd sleep with him every night. And it felt like years. I mean, I'd be back there for 3, 4, 5 hours, and it was just like a constant, like nails on a chalkboard, just a constant just force of him either putting his hands on me, or like he would grab my hand and pull it over and put my hand in his shorts. And I remember when he would make me touch him on his penis, like I didn't want to touch him. I didn't want to grab anything. So I just kind of would lay my hand there. This is really disturbing, but it was like really wet. And so I was thinking to myself, like, is this guy like pissing himself? And it was actually, he was like almost like ejaculating before I would even touch him. And because he was just so worked up and excited, which is like next level disgusting. By the time I was 11, probably, it was like fully performing oral sex on me in his bed. I remember when that first started happening, and I'm laying there in his bed, and this massive guy is performing oral sex on me, and I'm looking down on him. And I think when I was 12, I had my first orgasm, and it was from him performing oral sex on me. And when I did, I remember him looking up at me. Did you enjoy that? Did you like that? And what am I going to say? You know, I just had an orgasm. Like, what do you want me to say? I agree to it, and I say, yeah, you know, and it was good, and all these like nasty things. He would eventually coerce me once again to reciprocate everything he was doing to me. I would reciprocate to him. I eventually would perform oral sex on this grown man. One of the times he ejaculated, and it hit me in the face, and it actually hit me in the eye. And he looked at me, he laughed at me, and he said, you know, that was crucial. And so one of the things he would always do whenever we were hanging out with other friends, because we did have other friends we hung out with, if something happened, he would say, oh, that was crucial. And it was like always like a jab at me. It was funny to him, and I'd always laugh too. And I was always like, ha ha ha, yeah, it was. So that was like one of the more disturbing memories that I have. Another one that's really bad was he had bought me a leopard thong, and when I was like a leopard pair of panties, and like women's panties, and I'd wear them around his apartment, like his studio. I remember he bought them for me, and I'd put them on, and like he'd like have me like parade around his studio. Like, he's 36 years old, and he's got this little 12-year-old boy in a leopard thong like dancing around his studio. And it was, to me, for some reason, that's just like more humiliating. But yeah, it would continue to get worse and worse and worse. And so what makes this even more crazy is that during the week I was going home to my mom, and at this point, when I was about 11 or 12, she was into pain. She was very abusive with us. She was grabbing me by my face and punching me and slamming my head against the walls. And I went home to a bedroom that I had in my bedroom at home. I had a hole in my ceiling that was like 2 feet wide, about 4 feet deep. You could see straight into the attic above. So it would rain and it would snow and it would come into my room. And I slept on a little like 3-4 inch mattress with a thin little blanket, and I wet the bed every night. And so my home life was just, at 11 years old, 12 years old, I was seeing people completely out of their minds on my couch. Looked like zombies. I've seen pregnant family members sitting there on my couch so they couldn't even function. They're just sitting there shaking. That's what I dealt with Monday through Friday. So what am I going to do on the weekends? I've got to go somewhere else. When I was 12, my mom, she stabbed her boyfriend in the stomach over some in the bathroom. And me and my sisters were at my neighbor's house, and we walked outside, and there was a fire in the front yard. And then my mom's boyfriend comes out, and he's got blood all over him. And then my mom comes out the house, and she's yelling and screaming and going crazy. And me and my sisters at this point, we're all hysterical. We're crying. We can't control ourselves, because we know this is it. Like, mom is gone. Like, this is it. We don't know what just happened, but there's a fire. Mom is yelling. The police just show up. They throw my mom in the back of the car. I remember standing out in that street at 12 years old, looking at my mom in the back of this police car. It felt like I was in a reality TV show. Like, it was having an out-of-body experience. She was kind of telling me through the window, like, it'll be okay. I'll be back. I'll come and get you. The police officer drove away, and I was standing there in the street. My mom was just taken away from me. We go back into the house, and then one thing leads to another. My sisters go one way, I go another way. And for the next 4 months or so, I would bounce around to a bunch of different houses. And throughout all of this, I was still talking to my abuser every single night, and I was still going to his house every weekend. Not having a mother, not having a father, and then getting sexually abused in the worst ways every weekend of my life for about 4 or 5 months, until my grandparents, they found me at a friend's house. They wanted to adopt me, and so they took me in, and they actually had my sisters already. And my grandma asked us, like, do you want us to adopt you guys? And I said yes, without like, yeah, absolutely. Once again, I told my grandma, well, I got this friend I want to go hang out with. I was molested when I was about 5 or so, 4 or 5 years old, by a babysitter, and we told my grandparents about that when I was really, really young. But I know we did because they remember it, and they remember trying to get us out of the situation. I tell my grandma, well, hey, I got this friend that I want to hang out with. She says, well, who is it? I tell them. They're like, hell no, you're not hanging out with this guy. And so I defend him like I had done for the last few years. This was like a very unique relationship with me and this guy. I was very defensive of him, very protective of him. I knew his whole family. He had sisters that I would go to like their Thanksgivings and their Christmases. And so this guy is bringing this 12-year-old boy over for all of his Christmas holidays. Like, he doesn't have a girlfriend. He doesn't have a wife. He doesn't have friends. He's got this little boy he always brings with him. So I told my grandparents that. I'm like, yeah, I know him. I know his whole family. He's cool. He's fine. My grandparents said, well, we need to meet him. So the guy comes over, and it's very much like a first date. Like you're taking me out on prom night. Like, he pulls up, gets out of the car, and he's got his best 5XL red t-shirt on with his best clean gray sweatpants. And, you know, he's got his hair washed for once, and he shows up. It's this like real romantic, like, gentleman gestures, right? So he knocks, and he comes in the house, and he makes my grandparents laugh, and boom, they're comfortable. And so I'm right back in my hell. After introducing him, he would come to my house every weekend, right? And he would come and pick me up. And he was very like cordial about it. I think when my grandparents were involved, he may have realized that he was at risk of losing me because I had 2 parents. I had a father figure in my life with my grandpa. He actually became very close with my grandparents. Like, he would come in and talk, and that was, now that I'm thinking about it, I mean, it was brilliant on his part to like close up that relationship. I was right back in my hell, right? I'm going back to his house every weekend now. And at this point, I was almost 13. Things were really, really picking up and getting really heavy, where every weekend or every week he would call me. He was always depressed. He always wanted to kill himself. So he would always use that against me of like, if I don't come and see him, like, I'm the only thing that matters to him. It went from going up to his house and playing video games for most of the time, and then hanging out with him in his bed for a couple hours, to playing video games for an hour or two. And it'd be like 6 o'clock, and he'd say, I'm going to bed. And he'd go back there and lay down. And there was this, you know, a wall, and he would sit there and he would just punch the wall behind him until I went back there and got in bed with him. And it was his way of like, I'm depressed, I'm sad, you need to come back in here and love me. That's what would happen. And, you know, all I wanted to do was go play video games. When he wasn't sexually abusing me, it was truthfully, it was a lot of fun, and he was a lot of fun to be around. Like I said, it eventually got to the point where it was just, he was obsessed with it. There was a jar of Vaseline next to his bed. And I remember seeing this Vaseline for years, and it just disgusted me because I could see the grooves in it from where he had stuck his fingers in to use his fingers on me in the past, and it just disgusted me. I never wanted it to get to that point, obviously. Like I said, I couldn't disassociate. I couldn't detach. I was there. I was there for every single second of it. I was never in another place. He eventually convinces me to let him rape me, and I remember being there at 12 years old, almost 13, and I'm like naked on his bed, on my hands and knees on the edge of his bed. And, you know, I remember feeling his finger with a bunch of lube kind of like wipe me down on my butt, and he proceeds to rape me. And it wasn't this like brutal like rape session. It was as gentle as it could be. And I remember it happening. I remember all of those things. I remember how it feels, and I could hear him. I could feel his hands on my hips, like holding me still, because he, like I said, he had these massive hands, and I remember like hearing him. I remember when he was finished, you know, I can hear like the exhaustion in his like demeanor and his breath. He wipes me up with this towel. At 12 years old, I go back and I go sit on his toilet, and I go and sit there for 10 minutes to get everything else out of my body. And at that point, I was pretty convinced my life was over. I was pretty convinced that I had some sort of sexual disease, HIV, AIDS, something. I was convinced that everybody would know or think that I was gay. I was weird for sleeping with this man. I didn't have my mom and my dad. I'd already been through all of that. So my life was over. I was at the absolute deepest part of my life that I've ever been. and I was ready to die. I had been ready to kill myself for several years at this point. A few months later, I turned 13, and he's at my 13th birthday party. They threw me a surprise birthday party, and he's there with like all my family. I think my dad was actually there, and everybody's kind of like, who the hell's this guy? You know, and you know, this is just my sexual abuser. No big deal. He just raped me a couple months ago. But when I was almost 16, I was about a month away from being 16. I was up at his house one weekend, and I had a friend that was with me who was a couple years younger than me. I noticed that the guy was starting to make the same kind of gestures towards him that he had done to me. There had been like a few people that hung out with us occasionally, but this kid was very frequent, and he was a good friend of mine too. I don't know what the guy's like overall plan was or whatever, but he also ran a haunted house in that town of Bluffton, Ohio every year. And every year, 4,000 these little kids would come through this haunted house, and he'd be at the end of it handing them all candy. So there's no telling how many victims he had, and there's no telling how long it would have went on. But this night he took my friend back in his bed with him, and that was the first time that I can remember my friend going back there. And I thought to myself, like, this is it. Like, I'm not going to let this happen to anybody else. I messaged my friend who introduced me to the guy 5 years prior on the video game, and I just asked him to come over the next day so I could talk to him. My friend who I messaged shows up, and so I'm in my bedroom with him, and I'm talking to him, and I'm trying to get these words to come out. And just like that day that my mom was taken away from me, I could feel all those emotions coming back of like my blood and my energy, and everything was leaving, and I was like melting. And there's these cameras that are watching me because nobody's going to believe me. Everybody's going to deny me. Everybody's going to think I'm stupid. They're going to think I'm gay. They're going to think I have diseases. And my friend looks at me and he just says, "He touched you, didn't he?" And I turn and look at him, and I just fall apart. I fall to the floor. I'm crying. I'm sweating profusely. I have never cried so hard in my life. And after maybe 10 or 15 seconds, he looks at me and he says, "He did it to me too." And I was completely thrown off. Like, still had no idea. This guy who's my friend was like my hero. He was like my big brother. And when he said that, I was just like, what the hell? Like, and I fell apart again. And so he says, "You know, what do you want to do about it?" He says, "Do you want to report him or do you want to keep it a secret?" He's like, "It's up to you. I'll follow your lead." And I say, "Well, f- this guy, we got to get him. Like, I'm not dealing with this." And so we go out and we tell my grandparents, and my grandma was especially destroyed because of what had happened to me at 5 years old. And then she tried to save me then. And then I brought this guy into the house, and everybody trusted him, and he was part of our Christmases. And now she finds out this. And so she stays at the house. Me and my grandpa and my friend, we go to the hospital to do everything else. And we get there. And one thing I do remember about this day was when I got there, the nurses and everybody was thinking, and the police officer, they're like, "Well, how are we going to get this guy today? Like, we have to have hard evidence to get him today." And I said, "Well, I have his DNA on my body." Because that weekend I was abused. I knew at 15 years old, I'm very proud of myself for this, mostly because of the way they reacted. But at 15 years old, I knew to not take a shower and to not take my clothes off. And so I went home that Sunday. I never showered, never took my clothes off. And we go to the hospital and I tell them that, and they're just like, "Holy shit, take your clothes off right now." Take my clothes off. They swab me. They come back. Boom, we got his DNA in a couple places. And so the cop drives up there and arrests him, and that's like a whole another crazy story. As a matter of fact, it was his first sexual assault case he had ever handled. They got him to confess out of custody, basically, and so he would end up getting sentenced to, I think, 10 years for 11 counts, which is absurd. He had at least 10 years of pleasure between two victims at a minimum. There's no telling how long it went on before us or would have went on after. And that was back in 2011. So he would be free today to walk this world and do whatever the hell he wanted to do to people. But fortunately enough, he died in prison in 2019. He requested parole, was denied, and then died a few months later, about a year before he was supposed to get out of prison. I know I have the closure of reporting and my case being handled and solved and all of those things. I do not take that lightly. I cannot imagine what it would be like to not have that case solved and to not be able to have that justice. I don't know what that would be like. So to those who can't, I do empathize for you. My answer to that or response to that would be not to focus on the vengeance or the conviction. I would not focus on those things. I would focus on yourself, because you have to control what you can and you have to take care of yourself. So I tell everybody now, if you do report, you absolutely should report, but more importantly, do it for yourself so that you can get the therapy you can heal and you can get that weight off your back. Despite all of the bad things that I went through as a young man with the abuse and the sexual violence and all of those different things, I've moved on to become, and I am living an incredible life. I'm doing things that I never imagined that I would do, and there's nothing you could have told that 12-year-old boy the things that I've done now. I've won national construction awards. I served my country for 8 years. I've been all over the world, to include a combat deployment to Afghanistan. I'm married. I have 2 beautiful children. I have a nice home, 2 nice cars, and I'm telling my story now so that other people can understand that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. As long as you keep moving forward and remain strong and resilient, you can do amazing things. This summer, I'll be speaking at a gala for children who go through sexual violence. And to think that 200 or 300, 400 people are going to want to hear me talk and hear my story as a sign of hope and resilience and strength and gratitude, it's incredible. I would have never imagined that happening to me in a million years. And so that's the reason why I tell my story now, is so that other people can know, like, there is hope for me and I can do amazing things. So I'm writing a book right now that details all of this stuff, a little bit further detail, but it also details how I have survived afterwards. And a lot of that is really through perspective, gratitude, and strength. Through my lens of life, I try to give other people perspective of how life can be, how it should be, and how beautiful it can be. With that perspective, you can develop gratitude. And when you have gratitude and you express gratitude daily, you can use those 2 things to be very strong in your life and to do amazing things.